The moment I saw the house, I knew I'd made a mistake. But I wasn't about to back out now, not with my friends daring me, not after all the bragging I'd done about being fearless. The house loomed at the edge of the village, its dark silhouette jagged against the faint glow of the moon. It had a sloped, sagging roof, its tiles missing in patches, and wooden shoji screens that seemed to bow inward, as if the house itself were breathing in anticipation. I stood there, clutching the flashlight that I'd sworn I wouldn't need, dressed in my favorite black hoodie and jeans. My friends, idiots I both hated and adored, gathered around the rusted gate, yelling taunts and laughing like they had nothing better to do on a Saturday night. "Go on, Akira," said Kenta, shoving my shoulder. "Spend the night in the haunted house. It's just a bunch of old wood and creepy stories." I scoffed, masking the pit growing in my stomach. Yeah, easy. Just wait until morning and I'll be telling you about how lame it is." I pushed open the gate, its metal hinges screaming in protest. The air inside the property felt heavier, colder. I ignored it, stepping onto the overgrown path. The house was known as the Yamamura residence, a place locals whispered about but avoided after dark. Supposedly, it had belonged to a family cursed by an onryo, a vengeful spirit. Some said it was a scorned bride. Others claimed it was a murdered servant. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that no one had lived there in decades, and anyone who dared enter was said to emerge different. I reached the wooden veranda, its boards creaking under my sneakers. I turned back to the gate, my friends' faces barely visible in the faint moonlight. "See you in the morning," I called out, hoping my voice didn't betray my nerves. Then I slid open the shoji door and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, a mix of mildew, rotting wood, and something metallic like blood. I swung my flashlight around, its beam cutting through the thick darkness. The entryway was narrow, lined with cracked Geta sandals and dust-coated umbrellas. Ahead, a long hallway stretched into deeper shadows. The floor was covered in tatami mats, their edges frayed and discolored. I decided to explore, partly to prove to myself that I wasn't scared, and partly because standing still made me feel like the walls were closing in. The flashlight beam caught glimpses of the past. Faded calligraphy scrolls, a cracked porcelain tea set, and a family portrait hanging askew on the wall. The faces in the portrait were blurred, as if the ink had been smudged by unseen hands. In the silence, every sound felt magnified. The creak of the floorboards, the distant dripping of water, the occasional scuttle of something small and fast. I tried to convince myself it was just rats. But then came the whispers. They started softly, barely audible like the rustle of leaves. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't Japanese or any language I recognized. It was guttural, wet, and filled with a malice that made my skin crawl. "Just the wind," I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. I moved forward, determined to find a room to settle in for the night. My eyes landed on a sliding door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. For some reason, I felt drawn to it. The room was large, its walls lined with peeling Fusuma panels. In the center was a low wooden table, its surface scratched and scarred. Around it were zabuton cushions, their fabric torn and stuffing spilling out. But it was the ceiling that made me stop. Hanging from the rafters were dozens of paper dolls, their faces crudely drawn with ink, their bodies twisted and mangled. They swayed gently, though there was no breeze. I backed away, the flashlight beam catching a smear of something dark on the tatami. It led to a corner of the room, where a small shrine sat. The shrine was unkempt, its candles melted into grotesque shapes, its offerings rotted beyond recognition. But the thing that made my heart pound was the mirror. It was cracked, its surface fogged with grime, but I could still see my reflection. Or at least, I thought it was my reflection. The figure in the mirror moved, but I hadn't. It tilted its head, its face contorting into something that wasn't mine. Then it smiled, wide and unnatural, revealing teeth too sharp and too many. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the table. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled, its beam spinning wildly. The whispers returned, louder this time. They came from every direction, overlapping and chaotic. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight, and bolted from the room. The hallway felt longer now, stretching impossibly far. The shadows seemed to move, reaching for me with elongated fingers. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran, my sneakers slapping against the tatami. I turned a corner and collided with something solid. For a moment, I thought it was a wall. But then I looked up. Standing before me was a figure, tall and emaciated, draped in tattered robes. Its face was obscured by a veil, but its hands were skeletal, the fingers ending in jagged, blackened nails. It raised an arm, pointing down the hallway. "Leave," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves crunching underfoot. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, not caring where I ended up as long as it was away from that thing. The house seemed to shift around me, the walls bending and groaning like a living creature. I burst into a room and slammed the door behind me, my chest heaving. The room was empty except for a futon in the corner. It was pristine, unlike everything else in the house. Exhaustion and adrenaline warred within me, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down. I sat with my back against the door, clutching the flashlight like it was a lifeline. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt slippery. The whispers came and went, replaced by scratching sounds and faint footsteps that never seemed to grow closer. At one point, I thought I heard my friends calling my name, but their voices were distorted, as if underwater. Then, the futon moved. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift. But then it began to rise, as if something underneath it was standing up. My flashlight flickered, its beam barely illuminating the horror unfolding before me. The futon collapsed to the floor, and in its place was a woman. Her hair was long and matted, her kimono stained with dark, wet patches. Her face was wrong, one eye was missing, the socket hollow and oozing. Her mouth stretched too wide, revealing a black void that seemed to hum with energy. She lunged at me, her movements jerky and unnatural. I screamed, throwing myself to the side as her claw-like hands raked the air where I'd been. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam flickering wildly. I grabbed it and swung it toward her, the light catching her mid-step. She froze, her hollow eye locking onto me. Then she let out a guttural scream, so loud and piercing that it felt like my skull would split. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. The house seemed alive now, its walls pulsating, its floors groaning. Doors appeared and disappeared. Hallways twisted into spirals. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept going. Finally, I saw it, the front door. It was wide open, moonlight spilling inside. I sprinted toward it, the whispers and screams chasing me. Just as I reached the threshold, something grabbed my ankle. I fell hard, my chin hitting the floor. Pain exploded in my head, but I kicked wildly, desperate to break free. I turned my head and saw a hand, pale and clawed, gripping me. Above it, a face emerged from the shadows, grinning with too many teeth. With one last desperate kick, I broke free. I scrambled to my feet and threw myself outside. The air hit me like a wave, fresh and cold, and I collapsed onto the grass. Behind me, the house seemed to sigh, its walls settling as if disappointed. I don't remember how long I lay there before my friends found me. They laughed at first, thinking I'd chickened out early. But when they saw the scratches on my leg and the look in my eyes, their laughter died. I never told them everything I saw. Some things are too awful to put into words. But I do know one thing. The Yamamura residence isn't just haunted. It's alive. And it doesn't let you leave unscathed.